This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week my guest is Amy Bass, and we talk about her book, One Goal. My guest this week is the author of the incredible book, One Goal, and a professor at Manhattanville College. Amy Bass, welcome to The Other 51.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we were just talking before we started here about the semester for both of us and the kind of craziness of trying to teach and teach college during COVID-19. And so I'm wondering, you were saying that you teach in person outside, which is cool. And you also teach one online asynchronous course. What courses do you teach, just out of curiosity?
So this semester, my asynchronous course is probably my most popular course. It's ethics in sport. So it's an ethics course. I've taught it in person. I've taught it. It's just I actually created it as an asynchronous package just because I wasn't able to get as many students in it as wanted to take it. So even before the pandemic, I was heading in this direction with it. So it's a course about the moral questions that we can ask and think about within a sport context. And the course that I'm teaching outside is brand new. It's called Equal Play, Gender and Sport. So it is a cross-listed course between sports studies and women and gender studies. And it's Title IX and everything that goes with it.
I want to take both of those courses. They sound so good. The sports ethics course, I'm of course very curious in, and I've written about and thought a lot about the whole, stick to sports mentality that you see in a lot of sports media. And I'm wondering, have you noticed that, and kind of how do you kind of address that issue? Does that come up in your course at all, or how do you kind of address that or deal with that question?
Stick to sports came out of a very conservative space that narrowly defines sport as recreation and ignores everything else that's important about sports. So all of my classes, and really the premise for the sports studies major, is that there's really nothing that you can't use sports as a window into, whether you're talking about immigration or international politics or mega events or public space, community, gender, certainly racial politics, national politics. There's just on and on and on. And so I really think that if we stick to sports, I am sticking to sports and everything that comes with it. I'm fine with saying that. Yeah, I'm sticking to sports, but by training, I'm a historian. My first book was about the Olympic Games, but it's a civil rights history. It's about it's Mexico 68 and Black Power. And I'm sticking to sports when I'm writing about the Olympic Project for Human Rights. I'm sticking to sports and everything that goes with it. So it came out of a very conservative place. It has had an impact. I mean, when we look at some of the bloodletting that's happened within sports journalism in the last year or so, but if nothing else that we have seen in terms of the relationship between sports and COVID-19, it's just how much sports matter.
And obviously this leads into the discussion of the book that we're going to be talking about that I just finished last night, One Goal. It was a phenomenal book. I enjoyed it so much. And one of those books I would not have thought a high school soccer team in Lewiston, Maine would be something that I would read about, especially during the most tumultuous election in the U.S. in my lifetime. But here we are. And it was such a wonderful little respite for it. So I want to kind of dig deep into that book a little bit. First of all, where did you find out? Like, where was the genesis of this book? How did you kind of get turned on to this town and this team and the school and the story itself?
Sure. So in Lewiston, Maine is Bates College, which is my alma mater. I did my undergraduate work there. So, once you're a Bates student, Lewiston is sort of always on your radar. And the team first came to my attention on Facebook, of all places, because of a classmate of mine who stayed in Maine after graduation. So she just posted about this wonderful team, an article in the Lewiston Sun Journal. And at that moment, when this team sort of was making these headlines, it was a really interesting sort of triangular moment in terms of global history. The terrorist attacks in Paris, this is fall of 2015, had just taken place. If we can, it seems like a million years ago to think back to 2015. But the first of those, it was an awful night in Paris, just massacres in the streets, and that the first bomb that went off that night was actually at Stade de France, where a friendly was going on between Germany and France. So thousands and thousands of people, and yes, a soccer stadium would actually fulfill sort of the bucket list requirements for a terrorist attack. But because of sort of a weird series of events, the bomb went off in the tunnel. It didn't go off in the stadium. And so it started at a soccer stadium and spread throughout the city. But then that bomber in that stadium, sort of a myth began to emerge that the way he had gotten into France was by manipulating a Syrian refugee network. And this was not true. But it didn't matter that it wasn't true, right? 2015, we are sort of at the dawn of what was going to become fake news and how it worked. So it really took hold that refugee networks were funneling terrorists into other parts of the world. And as a reaction, a bunch of US governors, including then Governor of Maine, Paul LePage, who's an interesting character unto himself, to say the very, very least. He was one of the ones that pronounced that refugees would not be allowed to settle in his state, and that was when my ears really pricked up because I'm a historian by training. I know the U.S. Constitution super well, and I thought I'm pretty sure governors don't get to decide who does and doesn't live in their states. I don't think this is how it works. So I began to plunge in a little bit, and refugee resettlement was something I knew about, but I didn't know about it. And refugee resettlement is I think one of the most fascinating, complicated, transnational things that the world does. It is amazing to me to think about the networks of just tens of thousands of people, at least formerly in the United States. The United States, through the Obama administration, took about 100,000 refugees a year. That's gone down by about 90% under the current administration, particularly in terms of Muslim majority resettlements. But studying that was just this whole sort of explosion of global understanding, and so I had these 3 points, right? You had this bomb that goes off in a soccer stadium that starts off an evening of terror in Paris. You have the US governor's inane reaction to it based on a falsehood, and then you have the beautiful game being played by this Somali dominant team in, of all places, Maine. And so those 3 things started to sort of just gyrate in my head, and I wrote about 900 words about it for CNN. And while I kept sort of outlining the book in my head, it was the reaction to that CNN article that solidified it for me, because I read the comment section. And then the comment section,
Always a mistake, but
well, except this was really informative. It was awful. It was awful. But then the comment section came to me. So I would go into the office in the morning and I would have death threat emails and voicemails. And so the level of xenophobia and the level of Islamophobia that I encountered in the days after this piece, we had very obviously struck a nerve, and it was a nerve I wanted to explore. I had never sort of been at the center of such vitriol. So when an editor reached out and said, is there a book here? I was like, yeah, there's a book here. So that was it.
so how did you I'm curious, how did you kind of mentally and kind of for your own health deal with the threats that you're getting and those kind of messages that you're getting on that? Like you said, you're a historian, you're a professor. That's not in our normal day-to-day existence. So how did you kind of handle that and deal with that and kind of get through that?
Well, it's not in my normal everyday existence, but it is certainly in the normal everyday existence of the people that I was writing about. So I think, first of all, there's sort of that extreme sense of empathy that I think can be really critical in terms of launching a project. the other piece is man, these guys are such cowards, I have to say. And it's not my first, run with this. I'm pretty prolific in places like CNN or Salon or what have you, and they find you, especially I have to say as a woman who writes about sports. So usually I just get sort of, the what does that dumb blonde know about football? To which the answer is a lot. Um but this was different, and yet they were still cowards, right? Like, it was always voicemails that were like 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m., 7, when I wouldn't be there to answer the phone. It was always anonymous emails or made up accounts or what have you. There was one guy who actually called during normal hours and was former military, he was a vet, and he was like, "I'm not calling to harass you. I live in Arizona and I would really like to talk to you about immigration." And I was like, "Okay, let's do." He identified himself. Like, that you can deal with. That's dialogue. This other stuff is just cowardly hate. So I think that, yeah, it feels, I will say that the college gave me a really nice parking spot during that, with like well lit, near security. Um, but it goes away. And again, this isn't about my life. This is about the people that I'm writing about. So can you imagine? This is just one small taste.
Right. I was gonna say, for someone like you or a lot of people who kind of write about it, it happens and it's intense and it's awful. But you're right, it goes away, it stops, and then thinking about the people for whom it doesn't go away for.
Right. Right. I exactly.
Okay, so the kind of working back through the process. So the editor contacts you about this as a book. You say there's a book there. So what are your next steps? Like, how do you start reporting this? How do you start kind of piecing together, going from 900-word article and idea to full book?
So I contacted Coach and said, what do you think? Because if he didn't buy in, if Mike McGraw didn't say yes, and God love Mike McGraw, he thought about it for a couple days, and he should have, because what I was asking of him was huge. And I also circled back to Abdi Kadir Negi, who was the very first person that I talked to for the article, and Abdi Kadir is a community leader. He's someone who, born in Somalia, spent 14 years until he was 19 in Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. Was resettled in the Atlanta area, but made his way to Maine, as so many of them did, to just sort of get a sense of, this is what this project would be. But then I went into full historian mode. I spent a couple months just reading everything, getting my hands on anything that I could. So it was a very traditional. But then when I got up there, it was sort of like, okay, I was such a nerd. I was like, here's the list of people I want to interview, and here's the list of things I want to say, and it some of that happened, but like 90% of it went out the window, because first of all, I was writing largely about teenagers, and teenagers don't care about your research agenda. Teenagers were like, yeah, it's great that you keep emailing me, but I don't read my email. Um so it was, having Coach on board was huge, and I love Mike McGraw with every inch of my soul. He is a treasure of a human being, and I'm so grateful to have him in my life and in my family's life. He was so generous, and getting him on board helped a lot, because there is that relationship between coach and player, that isn't obedient. I mean, I knew I had to earn their trust on my own as well, but he was a huge step to me being able to do that. And also, he's so beloved in this community that, lots of people said to me, like, well, why did the people who are sort of on the other side of this want to talk to you? And the answer is Mike McGraw. That if Mike was on board, the community was on board. So he helped enormously. And there were lots of those kinds of helping people along the way. But I have to say, the kids and their families, um, you know, we worked hard. We worked hard to understand each other. I worked really hard to help them gain confidence in their stories and understand that their stories were important. It always amazed me. I would be, maybe hanging out, having Chinese food, or hanging on the sidelines, or at a summer practice, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, this happened, but you're not interested in that." And I'd be like, "Okay, yes, I am." And I get it. Like, if somebody, it's sort of like, when you ask somebody like, "Oh, how was your day?" And they're like, "Fine." It's how do you get beyond that? And the word was nice. Everything that I asked in the early days of this research. It was like, so what'd you think about it? Was nice. Nice was their go-to word. And then when I could sort of dig in and get more, um, it went further. I think, there's a couple kids who in particular were really my gateways. I think about Abdi Sharif Hassan and Malid Abdo and Muhammad Khalid. And Mo Khalid will be the first to tell you that he waited. He held me at arm's length for a long time. Um, and I think really our bonding moment was when he was doing his postgraduate year at Kent Academy, which isn't that far from me in Connecticut. So I was going up there every weekend. He and Abdi were doing a PG year there, and he got hurt on the field, and the trainer wouldn't let him go unless there was someone that she was sort of releasing him into their care. And he was like, "I'm with her," and I was like, "Okay, so I'm a guardian at this point," and that. But that was the kind of moment that it was like, I one of the reasons I kept going up there on the weekends was because all the other guys on the team at this prep school had parents coming in from the city to watch their games on the weekend, and these guys didn't. They were really far from home, and so I was going up and we'd get a bite after the game, and so you build relationships in different ways. I mean, Malid and I, the first time we talked, just because he's a talker, it was like a 3.5 hour conversation. We closed the high school that day, like the lights went off around us. So then the next time I saw him, he was familiar with me and talked to me, and that would bring like 3 more kids on board. So it was slow, but basically hanging out became a mode of operation for me. Like that's what I was doing. I was hanging out.
And how long were you up there reporting?
I was back and forth between New York and Maine from the fall of 2015 right until pandemic. I've never stopped. But the real hardcore first draft, and this sounds crazy from an academic, this was a whole new ball game, was about a year. I had a manuscript inside of a year. Um, but I kept writing, and in fact, we literally had to stop the press's moment because in the fall of 2017, as production was closing on the book, they won a second state championship. Um, and there was that epilogue in the book came out of that there were only 2 members of the team from 2015 who were still there, but Nuri had come back, and that winning goal was scored by one of the little brothers of the 2015 squad. So it was sort of like a find me white space at the end of this book to write 800 more words. So it was right up till the end.
And so in reporting this and hanging out becoming your kind of your go-to reporting style, what are the, like, logistically, I'm curious kind of what that looks like. I mean, you're recording, but when you're just hanging, as opposed to an interview, when you're hanging out, you're watching practice, you're talking to players, you're kind of observing. Like, are you taking notes? Are you using your phone? Like, how are you taking, as you hang out, how are you taking it all in a way that you can then turn into stuff later?
Yeah, so there were a couple different. The formal interviews were just recorded, and then transcribed, so that was easy. And then I was really lucky because other folks shared stuff with me. Like HBO did a small thing on this team and shared their transcripts with me from their interviews. So there all different kinds of sources. The sports writers at the Lewiston Sun Journal, I literally cannot sing the praises of more highly. I consider all of them friends now. I respect the heck out of them. They shared photos. They have an incredible staff of photojournalists for on this local paper. Um, but in any case, so that's one piece. Yes, taking notes. I have stacks and stacks and stacks of legal pads. They are a disastrous mess. There are Post-its. I would write on my hand, which I tend to do anyway. It's a terrible habit. Kids, don't do that, but I do. Cocktail napkins. Some of the great conversations that I had with Coach and with Dan Gish, the assistant coach, was over pitchers of beer after a game at the Blue Goose, which was, my college bar. And then now I sort of was a local, which I'm not. In Maine, I am not a local. I know that I'm not a local in Maine. Um, but so all of that. And then the other thing that really became one of my go-tos was my camera. Um, I'm only a recreational photographer, and I ended up taking about 2,000 photographs while doing the research. And I started to storyboard a lot. I had sort of vision boards, which I had never done before. I was always really sort of patronizing and dismissive of such things. I took a landscape painting class while I was writing this book, um, because the visual was really important in this book. Like it really struck me, as I was trying to sort of learn the art of reporting. I got books on reporting. Like, I'm not kidding. I broke it all down and rebuilt how I write a book. It was my fourth book, and I was there reading books on writing, which seems crazy. And my husband kept saying, like, "Don't you know how to do this?" And I was like, "Nah, maybe." Um, so I was reading, books like Storycraft, and thinking about, using sense exercises. What does a game smell like? What does a game sound like? How can I show what's going on at a game by talking about, what it's like to walk into a soccer game and they're selling chai and sambusa at the concession stand? What does that tell us without me writing? And lots of Somalis contributed to the Snack Shack. Just how we can sort of, that, I mean, that's good reporting, right? And it's learned, and thinking about that kind of storytelling was all part of it. So, and some of the photographs ended up in the book. I shot the cover of the book, which with an iPhone, which I'm shocked at that that's what we chose. There were so many photos by Russell Dillingham that I wanted to use from the Lewiston Sun Journal, but this is the one we went with. um, but so it was an all sensory experience, and it's a mess. Like, if you look at my boxes of stuff from writing this book, it's a mess. No one would ever be able to make sense of it.
So that leads to the next question: is how did you take that mess and turn it into that book?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was most grateful for was when I really sort of said, okay, I've got to sit down and write. And this was the same moment when I said to my daughter, "You're going to summer camp." Um, so it like, I really knew that I just needed to be able to, 14-hour a day it for an extended period of time by myself. Um, I opened up my files and I found that back in the early days of my research, like secondary research, I had sketched out a shell of the last two-thirds of the book, like really the game part of the book, the game. And I had no memory of doing it, which is really disturbing. Um, and I couldn't have been more grateful for something. So I actually had an outline. I was like, "Oh my god, I have an outline." I had mapped out, and I didn't know that I had done this. I had mapped out the crux of the book according to basically the season, which makes chronological sense. But then I needed to figure out, am I going to write about all the characters and their biographies up front? Am I doing this in real time? Or are we going to flash back and forward? And and really figuring out where the start of the book was happened early on, because Abdi, Sharif, Hassan, and I, had sat down early, early, early. Abdi was one of the first guys that I really spent hours and hours and hours with. Um, and the first maybe hour of our conversation was about the 2014 loss to Chevrolet. So that's why the book starts with that bus ride home. And then I had talked to, there were so many conversations that just fixated on that. Fixated on how the 2015 season started on the last day of the 2014 season. And they all talked about it the exact same way, and it was heartbreaking. So I knew that I was framing the beginning of the book that way. So really what became complicated was, where do you weave in sort of biographical background? Where do you weave in, the history of Somalia? Where do you weave in, past games? And that first section could have gotten, I still think it reads sort of complicated. You're going back to sort of the tragic losses of this team's past, and also trying to move the story forward. But I think that soccer, just like soccer sort of is the guideline for how this community came together in this season, I think soccer was really a guideline for me, because soccer is, it's a game of continuity. It's not a game of fracture. So kind of using the rules of the game, it really it began to sort of take form itself, almost on its own, because of what I was writing about.
So you mentioned that how you had to kind of learn how to do reporting, and we're reading books about that throughout the process. I'm curious, what is the difference between the historical writing that you've done throughout your career in your first couple books were and this type of writing?
Well, I think the biggest difference is that people read this type of writing. Um, I mean, I think it's something that we have to face, and look, I acknowledge, once I sort of was at a point of my academic career when I had tenure and then full rank, you can take that out for a spin, right? You can sort of do different things, but I had always sort of been doing different things. My work with NBC. Um, my increasing presence in terms of writing in popular media. So I think I learned a lot from my editors. My editor Jane at CNN is we work, we don't even need to really like talk. We have such a good back and forth in terms of her teaching me what grabs and what needs to be there, and deleting my constant need to add paragraphs and paragraphs of historical context to anything that I write. That said, she appreciates that, right? And she knows which pieces of that to keep. Um, so I think that all of that goes into it. But I think really, I wish academics wrote more like this. I wish we weren't so dismissive of popular work. That said, I wish more popular work took the methodology of academics more seriously, because I think that the way, historians, I think the best analogy I've ever seen is that historians are kind of like terriers, right? We just dig and dig and dig and dig and dig because we're positive we're going to find something awesome. Um, and I think that that relationship between journalists and historians, maybe especially, is a tenuous one, because we're sort of like, why are you guys on the bestseller list and we're not? And they're sort of like, why do you guys write with all these footnotes and all this jargon? Um, and I think, I really kind of like the crew of folks that I've assembled over the years as sort of a circle. Um, Many of whom are journalists, and sort of, writing is a very solitary thing, and yet it's an incredibly generous community. um, I host a series for the New Rochelle Public Library called Cocktails and Conversation, and just the different kinds of writers that I've been able to bring through, who are so generous with time and advice, and it's a lovely thing to be. So I think that all of that goes into sort of your education when you want to make a change. But I think the biggest thing that had to happen for me was to sort of say, no, I don't know how to do this. um and I'm going to think, I think one of the best things that you can do is read stuff just voraciously that you like, but also read stuff that you don't like, because you also want to learn about what kind of writer you don't want to be. So read. And that's, whenever I do a lot of work with schools now, because one goal very unexpectedly has become I mean, I was surprised. I certainly wasn't writing it with this in mind, has become a common read for a lot of schools. Um, but just talking about that you should be, don't put a book down because it's awful. I've heard a lot of people say, like, oh, there's not enough time in the world to read books you don't like. But as a writer, you should read books you don't like, because you need to know what you don't like about them. So I think all of that goes into it, and I have no doubt. And my agent kept saying to me, you've got to be really careful here that you don't come off as, some PhD writing about a soccer team. They're a little wary about that, and it's always that they over on the publisher side. And I remember when I finally gave some pages, and it was only for marketing purposes. Like, I was not ready to hand anything over yet. But my editor needed some stuff for, basically publishing's version of the upfronts when they were, meeting with the industry. And there's a line in the introduction, um, that he circled, and he said, I am now confident that you can do this. And it's in the introduction when I write that soccer is how these kids live where they landed. And it was that sentence that he circled. And of course, as a historian, I then had like 3 more paragraphs after that before the chapter ended. And he was like, and we are crossing all the rest of this out. It ends with this sentence. And I was like, all right, lesson learned that, when you have a sentence like that is intended to punch someone in the stomach, let the reader recover and don't drown them in more. So it's those little tiny lessons that just build and build and build.
Can you think of an example of a book that you hated or didn't like and what you learned from it?
Oh God, that would be terrible.
As I was saying that, yes, I realized that's terrible.
I can't do that. I just said the writer community was lovely. No, I'm not doing that.
No, that's for as I asked that, I'm like, that is a terrible thing to ask them. That's a horrible thing. I apologize for that.
No, and I don't. You know what? I will say this. I think that what's even more instructive is books that I love that like someone else didn't.
Okay.
So, for example, I am in a book club. I have a circle, and it's a book that I devoured. One of my favorite books in recent memory is Gish Jen's book, The Resistors, which is
okay. You told me about this on email, yeah,
kind of about baseball. And I went into book club. I was hosting. I was so excited. And one of the people in book club that I respect the most in terms of her opinion about writing, and she's also an academic, hated the book. And the person that I expected was not going to like the book because it was just too esoteric or too baseball or whatever, loved the book, just like me. She and I, who have never agreed on anything, we agreed on this. And so I found it fascinating. I literally think that Gish Jen has written like a book of a generation in The Resistors. I marvel over it. And just to see the different reactions to Gish's work. I find that fascinating. So I think that, I'll say that's a book that I loved that not everybody loved.
So I always ask my guests, what's the best thing they've read lately? If you want to talk more about The Resistors at this point, feel free. Or if there's something else that you've read lately that kind of really struck a chord, love to hear about it.
I think The Resistors is a book that I've been incredibly passionate about since I read it. Gish and I did the Key West Literary Seminar together. My gosh, in January of this year, it feels like a million years ago, that so many of us assembled together. It was Key West actually did one of their famous seminars on sports writing. So it was a collection of amazing people, Jane Levy and Rowan Ricardo Phillips, and I was there. Gish Jen was there. It was really Buzz Bissinger. I got to hang out with Buzz for a week. So Gish's book 100% is one of the things. I have to say, I really like Jeff's book, The Mighty Oak. Jeff Pearlman's newest book on the Lakers and Kobe, I think, is magnificent. And it's, I think I'm not just saying that because he talks about me on the first page. But it's, I'm trying to, I just taught 2 books that I love teaching. I just taught Wyoming Tyus's sort of memoir, Tiger Bell, which I think is a super teachable book. And I just had students read Curveball, which is the biography of Toni Stone, who's the most prominent woman to have played in the Negro Leagues. So it's rare for me to teach 2 sort of autobiographical works in the same semester. But I absolutely loved teaching those. But yeah, I think the book that's still dominating my head, I've obviously been reading a couple other books since then, but I really recommend giving Gish Jen's The Resistors a try. It's dystopian, which is not usually my cup of tea, but I'm just kind of in awe of someone that can create a whole different version of America, and it's still about baseball.
So that sounds awesome. You had recommended that to me on email, and it's on my list to get as I read through a bunch of books right now. But I'm moving that up to the top of the list, I think I'm very excited.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
So, Amy, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, and best of luck on whatever your next project ends up being.
Thanks so much. It's been great to talk to you, Brian.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Show notes for this and all of our episodes can be found at sportsmediaguide.com by clicking on the Other 51 tab. If you like the show, please consider giving it a rating and a review, either at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help people find the show. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.